Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library, and I have a great story to tell you. We are going to delve into ancient history again tonight with a talk about the ancient Celts and some of the mysteries that their culture still conceals. Why are there Celtic mysteries? Because the Celts are, at the same time, very studied from Western to Central Europe. There have been generations of scholars and archaeologists analyzing every source, every large site that we know of, towns, tombs, earthworks. And at the same time, the Celts didn't leave any written texts. Written sources about them are all foreign, especially Roman, and to a lesser extent Greek. So they don't have a direct voice. We can only guess, imagine, and recreate what their lives, their society, and their worldview were like. So tonight we're going to approach different aspects of Celtic history by examining different open questions. I will tell you about the Celtic Druids, their role, their origins, and their importance in their respective communities. We will also travel to Ireland and take a look at an important site called the Hill of Tara. We will also try to understand why these large Celtic Hillforts were for. And finally, I will tell you about a mysterious artifact, the Gundestrup Cauldron, which questions various aspects of Celtic society. We have a lot to discuss, but don't worry, I'll do the talking, and you may just adopt a comfortable position. But first, I would like to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project. Get more from it and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to contribute directly to our work financially. Our least expensive tier is $3.50 per month, but it doesn't mean you will get less. We let people contribute what they wish or can, and everyone gets everything that is on our page. Because the world is a better place when the sun shines for everyone. You will gain access to 24 exclusive episodes. We add a new one every month, and you can listen and download all the episodes with and without background sounds. And as a token of gratitude, we offer advance releases to our patrons. We have added links to Patreon, as well as links to different streaming options, which may be better suited for you. You will find them in the description of the episode. And now, before we begin, if you wish to, you may close your eyes and allow yourself to forget about any worries. Assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath. And when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now, off we go. This term, Druid, even though it is historical, and Druids very much existed, comes shrouded in myth and mystery. There is a kind of fantasy feel to it, probably a consequence of Celtic culture inspiring fantasy literature. And of this renewed interest in Celtic religion and mythology that appeared since the 19th century, but also because Druids are genuinely mysterious. Various aspects of their function, their role in Celtic cultures, are still unclear. We know they were at the same time priests, teachers, judges, advisors, healers, and keepers of knowledge. We will detail all of that. So let's take a look at what we know about them. So first, when did Druids appear? It seems it was not immediate with Celtic culture. It took centuries for this particular function of Druids to take shape. Celtic culture is traced back to the late Bronze Age in Europe, that is to say, the 13th to 18th centuries BC. During this late Bronze Age began what some archaeologists call the Proto-Celtic phase, which is visible in the Hallstatt culture, an archaeological culture that has been identified in Central Europe and named after a village in Austria, Hallstatt. But what do these terms actually mean? Proto-Celtic or Hallstatt culture. They mean that the characteristics observed in archaeological remains show distinctive traits. The art and the crafts, with their patterns and their proportions, the burial practices, the material culture, the kind of objects these people had and how they were made. These are traits that make the identification and differentiation of archaeological cultures possible. They also help to compare different sites from different periods. And with all this information, archaeologists can determine how ancient cultures spread, where and how they evolved in time. With the many Celtic archaeological sites across Central and Western Europe, the spread and the evolution of the Celts is rather well understood. And this is what Proto-Celtic means, the appearance of specific traits that would evolve into a classical or peak Celtic identity. These Proto-Celtic characteristics that appear in the Hallstatt culture were not limited to that place. By the way, Hallstatt is a name given to this cultural profile, but it was present over a large area. So this Proto-Celtic profile lasted until the 5th century BC, a time when another successor culture is detected, called Latin culture. This time after another site in Switzerland. And this new, fully Celtic profile emerged around 450 BC. In the 5th century BC. The 5th to the 3rd centuries BC were a time of fast expansion for the Celts. By the 3rd century BC, the traits from this Latin culture had spread, conquering a large area from Ireland or the Iberian Peninsula in the west to Romania in the east. A Celtic present has even been found in Anatolia, in central Turkey, cut from the main area, and certainly the product of migration. We have evidence that the Druids existed in the periods of expansion of this Celtic culture in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. Before that, there is no evidence in archaeology that any function comparable to the Druids already existed. Now, maybe they appeared earlier, and we just don't have traces. but it is believed that their particular function evolved from the priests, the class of religious leaders that was already present in Proto-Celtic culture at the time when this Latin culture started to rise, 5th and 4th centuries BC. And the Druids at the same time were found in the large area covered by the Celts, south of Germany, north of Italy, Austria, Hungary, France, a large part of Spain and Portugal, Belgium, the south of the Netherlands, Great Britain, and Ireland. The Celts didn't write. They had an oral tradition of which the Druids were important keepers. So the first writings about Druids came from foreigners, neighbors of the Celts. And these writings appeared in the 3rd century BC onward. The Greeks knew the Celts, especially the ones living to the north of them in the Balkans, and they tended to see them as archetypal barbarians, peoples that were outside of civilization. And to the Romans, the Celts were a big threat for a long time. When the Roman Republic was in the process of expanding to all of Italy, there were important Celtic settlements in northern Italy. And in 390 BC, the Celts, led by a chief called Brennus, defeated a Roman army and sacked Rome. So Greek and Roman sources were not kind to the Celts, but still, chronicles left by Greek authors such as Posidonius in the 2nd century BC, or Roman authors including Julius Caesar, as he invaded Gaul, which was the main center of Celtic population in the 1st century BC. There are precious direct accounts. They tell us that by the 3rd century BC, at the latest, Druids were a recognizable class in Celtic society since foreigners identified them, and also that the influence, the prestige of the Druids probably peaked by the 1st century BC in Gaul, later in Britain, their decline being due to the Roman conquest. After the 2nd century AD, Druids completely disappear from records in Roman-dominated regions. It seems Romanization and Christianization had successfully suppressed them. Of course, they went on a bit longer in Celtic regions that were Christianized later, like Scotland, Ireland, or Wales. As I mentioned, Druids probably evolved from the priestly class in Proto-Celtic culture. And here we touch on a theory, a hypothesis about Indo-European peoples, which the Celts were a part of, called the Trifunctional Hypothesis. The Trifunctional Hypothesis, which was proposed in the 20th century, suggests that ancient Indo-European societies, or at least many of them, were organized into 3 distinct social classes or social functions, each with specific roles. The first function was called sovereignty, the class that governed and maintained the sacred knowledge. Indo-European peoples spread widely in antiquity, from northern India and Persia to Western Europe. So representatives of this first function would include the Brahmins in ancient India, the Celtic Druids, or the Flemings or Fleminese in early ancient Rome, the class of priests. The second function would have been the warriors, a group consisting of the warriors and protectors responsible for defense and everything related to military prowess. this class would have upheld physical strength and material values like courage or tenacity. That would have been the class of the Kshatriyas in ancient India, the Celtic or later Germanic elite warriors, or the equites or equites, the knights in early Rome. Like the Flamines, the priests, and the equites, the knights, was a role that was very important in the first centuries of Roman history before these classes declined. And finally, the third function, the one having to do with production, everyone that ensured material survival and economic activity, essentially agriculture and crafts. And here again, this group finds concrete examples from India to Europe. This hypothesis is not as systematic as it sounds. It acknowledges that societies could evolve from this Indo-European social structure and acquire different patterns. For example, the model of three functions no longer works in Roman Empire or in classical Greece, because the boundaries between the functions, particularly the first and second, became increasingly blurred. Importantly, this tri-functional frame would be observed not just in the way society is organized. It would also be prominent in mythology, with figures symbolizing each function, and the legal system too, with different status for each function. And that is why it is described as an ideology, a way of seeing the world carried by Indo-European cultures, at least the early ones. So in that frame, the Druids would be the perfect representatives of this first class, the one called sovereignty. Still, this functional hypothesis is to be taken cautiously because there are many possible critiques to it. It has been accused of overgeneralizing because other branches of the Indo-Europeans, like Germanic peoples or the ancient Greeks, did not really fit the model very well. So the critique here is that it would be based on selective and biased evidence for the sake of building a compelling model, which is always a risk in social science. Yet another line of criticism is that the archaeological record often fails to validate the trifunctional hypothesis. Tombs, for example, do not seem to be differentiated according to these three functions. Another group of critics argues that perceived similarities between cultures may simply stem from familiar environmental or economic pressures, which could spontaneously produce comparable forms of social organization. That interpretation makes sense too. So as you see, the trifunctional hypothesis is debated, and we should probably not take it as a fact, but it helps understand the functions of Druids in Celtic societies, which is why I'm telling you about it. Druids were not just people tasked with a long list of jobs that could look disjointed. What is the connection between priest, teacher, judge, keeper of the community's memory? There is actually one common thread here, which has to do with this concept of sovereignty, function. In this trifunctional hypothesis, the Druids were the individuals in charge of this concept, the keeping of society's political and spiritual order. And this is just what the Druids did. They were priests because they kept the connection with the divine, teachers, or living memories, because knowledge is what keeps the culture together in order, generation after generation. They were political advisors because the political order needed this spiritual and cultural input to be legitimate and function properly. Nothing could go against the will of the gods or against the traditions established because of the will of the gods. And the Druids were the interpreters, the keepers of these. Now, concretely, what did they do? First, they were spiritual leaders, what we could call priests, intermediaries between the Celts and their vast pantheon of gods. The pantheon, which is actually poorly known, especially in old times. Some gods like Lugh, the god of light, Cernunnos, a horned god with antlers that was interpreted as a god of fertility, but it is unsure, or Bridget and Belinus, healing deities. But this pantheon is very mysterious. It seems there were big differences in this pantheon, or at least the names of the deities, depending on the regions. So it is hard to tell which gods or goddesses really mattered the most. As priests, the Druids conducted rituals, ceremonies that would often take place near natural features like springs, rivers, or in sacred groves, or also in and around stone circles not built by the Celts, but by their predecessors, sometimes thousands of years earlier. And as the memory of who built these stone sites had long vanished, the Celts may well have believed that these circles were actually natural features, or places created by the gods, or the forces of nature. Still, in their religious role, the Druids were also seers. They interpreted omens, like flights of birds or dreams to guide decisions, and that made them very useful to consult before any major decision was taken. A debate remains whether Celtic Druids practiced human sacrifice. There is no evidence that it was carried out on a large scale, and most references to it come from foreign authors like Julius Caesar. However, Caesar may have exaggerated these practices for political and propagandistic purposes. As he was in the process of conquering Gaul, it was in his interest to portray the Gauls, Celtic peoples, of what is now France and Belgium, as particularly savage. Doing so would not only make his own achievements appear more impressive, but also reinforce the image of Roman civilization as more humane and civilized by comparison. There is evidence of killings around sacred sites, yes, but it is unclear whether these were really sacrifices. It could be, but it could also have been just ritualized executions of people who had committed serious offenses and were sentenced to the death penalty, something that every single ancient culture practiced. In any case, these spiritual and religious functions seemed political and legal. As I said, the Druids were also advisors, judges, occasionally mediators and diplomats too, a field where they could be very useful, because the Celtic world was always very fragmented politically. There was a multitude of chieftains of clans with small domains, and this Celtic world was essentially united by culture. The languages of neighbors were similar, They worshiped the same gods. They had a similar material culture, building techniques, and social organization. And the Druids embodied this common thread between Celtic peoples that made them able to mediate, negotiate, and organize alliances, leveraging their neutrality and their prestige. And finally, they had these cultural functions of teaching, transmitting knowledge, which consisted of religious beliefs, poems, tales, a role in which they were not alone. There were the bards, too, who were poets and musicians responsible for entertainment, probably, but also cultural preservation and transmission. It is believed the bards were the subordinates of the Druids, and finally, thanks to their knowledge of medicine and plants, the Druids were also healers, practicing medicine based on a mix of remedies, often plant-based, and rituals. Now, the existence of the functions of these Druids are quite telling about Celtic culture. They tell us about plenty of things, actually. And first, about the importance of nature in Druidic rituals, with the use of natural sites for ceremonies. The reverence for nature. All of this shows that Celtic spirituality emphasized the connection to natural sites, vegetation, and animals. There was always some of this in ancient cultures, as these were natural concerns in societies that remained closely connected to the natural world. Most people lived in rural environments and were exposed to nature on a daily basis. However, this connection appears to have been particularly pronounced among the Celts. The fact that they apparently worshipped a lot of spirits, apart from the gods, they believed that springs, rivers, forests, mountains, every natural feature had its own independent spirit, a kind of belief often called animism. And this reveals a worldview in which the divine dimension seeped through or permeated the natural world. There was probably a depth here, a spiritual or philosophical dimension that got lost because it was immaterial, and foreign authors could not write about that, about something they did not comprehend, or just didn't matter to them. According to Caesar, in his account about Gaul, the Druids taught the doctrine of reincarnation, believing souls or spirits passed to new bodies after death. We do not know if this is completely accurate, and if it was, whether this was believed across the Celtic world or something more local. But if true, that could have encouraged bravery in battle, something the Celts were known for. They seemed to engage in combat with more disregard for their own lives than other peoples, and this was noted across the Celtic world. Still, about that religious or cosmological worldview that the Druids carried, it seems the Celts had good astronomical knowledge too, very empirical. As far as we know, they had no calculations, but they cared deeply about the positions of celestial bodies, their alignments, the seasons. They celebrated these changes of seasons and had a calendar. And this also tells us of the cosmology that integrated spirituality, astronomy, and nature in ways that we can only guess. And the presence of the class of Druids at the top of the power or near it in Celtic societies also tells us about the importance of learning, of culture, and of wisdom in their worldview. This is very far from Greco-Roman discourse about barbarians, right? The Celts clearly didn't have the monumental architecture, the written culture, or the technological achievement of the Greeks and the Romans. But as peoples, they were highly cultured in the sense that their social organization, their material culture, their worldview and values, all these were complex and rich. Still, this illustrates everything that makes the Druids an ongoing mystery, because you see the amount of things we ignore about them. The exact nature of their beliefs has been lost in the depths of history, and so are the rituals they practiced. There are movements called neo-druidic. These are small, but it is still a thing. But they appeared in the 19th century and redeveloped a doctrine and rituals based on the perceived or reimagined ways of the ancient Druids. The real historical thread was cut at the end of the Roman Empire or with Christianization, and everything after is a reinvention. We also ignored their training and organization. It has been written in antiquity that they went through a lengthy formation, about 20 years, during which they memorized vast oral traditions, rituals, probably more recipes for remedies and potions, rules for the interpretation of omens. But how did they learn? Did they use any mnemonic techniques for that? We don't know. And we also ignore whether every Druid was independent or if they were one of several pan-Celtic organizations that congregated, sometimes named or observed the Druids, maybe if there was some kind of hierarchy between them. All of this is also unknown. And finally, we also ignore how they were treated within Celtic communities. They were important people, and we can't assume that they had privileges or a degree of material wealth, but we lack details. We also don't know if they were all males or if women were allowed. There are sources like Tacitus, a Roman author, that mention female priestesses or female prophets among the Celts, which seems to at least overlap with the functions of Druids, if true. But we don't know the exact involvement of women in Druidic roles. That's another mysterious aspect. And finally, another lost continent is the decline of druidism after a peak in the 1st century BC. As I mentioned before, the Roman conquest had contributed to it, not because Celtic religion would have been prohibited. The Romans left local cults alone as long as they appeared compatible with their political and social order. But as we saw before, the functions of the Druids were completely intertwined with the Celtic worldview and lifestyle, of which they were protectors, the keepers. The Roman conquest represented an enormous threat to this lifestyle, because the alternative Roman life was very attractive, more urban, technically more complex and refined, in the sense that it was materially richer, with plenty of little luxuries that the Celts did not get to experience on such a scale before. Fabrics, plenty of wares, exotic goods, public services like baths and forums, urban life, All of this was attractive, especially to the elite, and ultimately the reason why the Roman Empire lasted so long and integrated so many peoples is that it was attractive in many ways. Politically, to guarantee peace; economically, for prosperity. So they would accept this integration, and becoming Roman was desirable to them. And in this new Roman order, there was no longer a need for Druids. It is probably why they declined and disappeared. The movement accelerated by Christianization in the last 2 centuries of Roman Empire. But the exact pace and chronicle of this decline is unclear. They seem to vanish from the face of the earth during the first centuries of our era in the Roman-dominated Celtic regions, that is to say, across roughly 80% of the Celtic world. With them disappeared the backbone of Celtic society, the class that embodied the Celts' reverence for ancestral knowledge, tradition, and the natural world. By studying the Druids, we get a glimpse at the richness of Celtic culture and an invitation to imagine the wisdom, the world view that they carried into the mists of time. I mentioned the Druids organized rituals in natural sites and near stone circles, megalithic structures left by their predecessors in the regions where they lived. One such site, and one of the most important in Celtic archaeology, as well as one that still retains many mysteries, is Tara, the Hill of Tara in Ireland. The name Tara is an anglicized form of the Irish name Tower, though its exact meaning remains uncertain. I'm probably pronouncing it very poorly. And this site is of great importance to the ancient history of Ireland, because its story began long before the Celtic period, reaching back to the Neolithic, thousands of years before the arrival of the Celts. What makes Tara particularly remarkable is that it remained in use for different purposes over the course of several millennia. We're going to start to see that. It eventually turned into a center of Celtic religious life, politics, and even mythology. It is celebrated as the ancient seat of the High Kings of Ireland. It has many features, so let's take a look at it to also examine Celtic history from another angle. The Hill of Tara is not a single monument. Rather, it is a complex of monuments and archaeological features spread across the hill. One of the most important of these is the Mound of the Hostages, a Neolithic tomb known as a passage tomb. These structures typically consist of a burial chamber connected to the outside by a narrow passage and are covered by a mound of earth or stone, giving them the appearance of a small artificial hill. The passage inside its entrance is aligned with the sunrise on the equinoxes, the transitions of seasons. Searches on the site have revealed that it contained the cremated remains of more than 200 people. The structure itself, the mound, is 15 meters in diameter, that's about 50 feet, and 10 feet high, about 30 meters. It was dated around 3200 BC, the 4th millennium BC, that is to say, way before the Celtic Age. You remember Proto-Celtic culture, The Hallstatt culture appeared in the Bronze Age in the second half of the second millennium BC, and the fully formed Celtic culture, Latin, is more from the 5th and 4th centuries BC, 2,700 years after the building of this mound. It is called the Mound of the Hostages because, at a later stage during the Celtic period, the practice was to hold hostages from other tribes to guarantee alliances or peace. And the association of this practice with the mound on the hill of Tara is an indicator, among many, of the political importance of this site. It was a place where alliances or agreements were sealed, maybe where hostages were exchanged or at least negotiated. Another feature of the hill, more recent because it is from the Iron Age, is Leafal, the Stone of Destiny, a small standing stone which is traditionally believed to be the coronation site of the High Kings of Ireland. Who were these High Kings of Ireland, by the way? They were the main rulers of Ireland in the pre-Christian Celtic period, and their authority is strongly associated with the site of Tara. They were not kings of Ireland in the sense we could imagine, because Ireland was politically fragmented at the time into many small states. But they were a kind of supreme authority, kings above other kings, which embodied the cultural unity of Ireland beyond its fragmentation and often internal conflicts. Legend has it that the Stone of Destiny, when touched by the rightful king, would roar. In reality, it is unsure whether it was a coronation site or not. There is no proof of it, and it could well be just a legend that appeared later. Other monuments on the hill include different earthworks, multiple circular works that served as ring forts or ceremonial enclosures. Some of them could have been habitations too. And there is also a larger rectangular earthwork, 230 meters long, about 750 feet, called the Banquet Hall. It is traditionally identified as a feasting hall, but archaeologists tend to doubt that it had a roof, so maybe it was more a ceremonial pathway used for rituals or large gatherings. The site has been thoroughly studied, and this has helped uncover its very long history. So it started in the Neolithic as a burial site. We don't know what its importance was at the time, but the size of the mound of hostages and also the beauty and strategic location of the hill, offering sites all around in the valley nearby, suggests that it was important. It may or may not have been abandoned as a site, but along the first millennium BC, the hill turned into a kind of political and ceremonial place of the Irish Celts. It could not be called a capital. It was not a town with permanent inhabitants, but it was certainly regularly used for ceremonies, probably political events too, like meetings, coronations, state burials maybe. We know it from its long association with the high kingship and the number and the size of the structures, especially these earthworks that required significant manpower for their creation, and after that, to keep them in a good state for centuries. Tara was not abandoned when ancient Celtic cultures declined in Ireland with Christianization. It seems it was used for some time for Christian ceremonies. And there are legends of St. Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland, who historically was credited for spreading Christianity across the island in the 5th century AD. He was not the only one, but he did. According to later tradition, it was at Tara that St. Patrick challenged the Druids and confronted their beliefs in the 5th century. However, there is no firm evidence that this event actually took place, and the story is generally regarded as legendary. Early Christians may have appropriated the site, which still retained some political importance during the Christianization of Ireland. Nevertheless, Tara appears to have declined from the 6th century onward and gradually faded from prominence over the following centuries. Yet by the time its political role began to wane, the site was already nearly 4,000 years old and had witnessed much of Ireland's pre-Christian history. For that reason, among others, Tara eventually became a powerful national symbol in modern Ireland. The site has been studied extensively, and archaeologists have a fairly good understanding of its various functions. Most of its major structures have probably already been identified, and yet, despite all this work, some important mysteries remain unsolved. First, there is the question of the monuments. Scholars have put forward a number of theories regarding their purpose, whether ceremonial, political, religious, or practical. However, in the absence of written records, their exact function remains uncertain, and no interpretation can be confirmed with complete confidence. The Celts obviously didn't leave any, and contrary to other parts of the Celtic world, no travelers ever wrote about Tara during the Celtic era. So the size and care for the site prove that it was very important, but things become much less clear when it comes to the specifics. The same is true of the institution of the high kingship and the extent of its authority. Were there periods when Ireland was really unified under a single king crowned at Tara? Maybe. There is no proof to the contrary. There could have been periods of unification, even though we also know that many tribes coexisted and shared the territory of Ireland while remaining fiercely independent. So there were unifications. They were temporary, and the extent of the king's power is unknown. It could have also varied over time, but we know close to nothing of this. Maybe the high king status was more symbolic, a kind of moral authority, a symbol of cultural unity, or the keeper of a place where conflicts could be mediated, solved by negotiation rather than war. We don't know, and the historical evidence is inconclusive. And finally, circling back to the Druids, we also ignore completely what rituals took place at Tara, how and for what reason, and what their meaning was. Like many concrete aspects of Celtic practices, the immaterial or social dimension of this culture, we lack elements to do much more than imagine them. But still, here again, like we discussed about the Druids, the existence of Tara, its diverse features, tombs, standing stones, enclosures. This reveals a sophisticated society with traditions, rules, a high degree of symbolism, and here again, the site itself, with its views of the valley around, points to the importance of integration with nature in Celtic aesthetics and symbolism. Speaking of Celtic sites and works, let's take a look now at the third type of mysteries, the numerous Hillforts left by the Celts. What are these? They are among the most visible architectural remains associated with the Celtic world. Hillforts emerged during the Proto-Celtic period in the Late Bronze Age and became increasingly common after the 8th century BC as the Celts entered the Iron Age. They continued to shape the landscape until the Roman conquest gradually absorbed the Celtic regions of Spain, Gaul, and Britain. Today, thousands of Hillforts are known across Europe, including roughly 4,000 in Great Britain and Ireland alone. These Hillforts were not random piles of dirt with a palisade on top. They were carefully planned settlements placed on hills or ridges or coastal cliffs, sometimes to exploit natural defenses. They consisted of very thick earth walls, ramparts, ditches, and timber palisades, with complex entrances that were designed to confuse attackers. It was possible to live inside them too. Some could have housed hundreds of stone huts, especially in continental Europe. Others called oppida, and oppida is a Latin term meaning a large fortified settlement or town, a place that is at the same time designed for defense and where to live. So some of these settlements in continental Europe were actually entire fortified towns. The Hillforts were built with local materials, earth, timber, and stone, with the roofs of houses probably made of straw or wood. Simple materials. The engineering of the Hillfort could be impressive, with multiple layers, multiple lines of defense, complicated pathways inside the Hillfort, which forced attackers to zigzag inside and expose their flanks, many different successive defensive positions to keep fighting. So obviously, these sites were designed for defense. They were fortified settlements, but not only. Their size and their visibility made them also settlements of power, like medieval castles could sometimes be centuries later. A way to make domination of an area visible and obvious to everyone, to discourage aggression against the power in place. Many forts show no evidence of battle, so either way, they were dissuasive enough or they had other functions. And one that comes to mind, since the forts were populated, is that they were also community hubs for trade or for festivals, maybe a place where people could gather or find certain products and services. They could also have served as sacred sites for rituals, and some include burial mounds. This type of tomb we have talked about before in the part about the Hill of Tara. So these hill forts were probably multifunctional, military, political, economic, religious, maybe, and this probably depended on the local context. We don't know the specifics, but that doesn't sound too mysterious. What is more puzzling is a series of discoveries that started in Scotland before more were found across Europe. Forts that were vitrified. That is to say, the stone walls had been fused by intense heat, up to 1200 degrees Celsius, about 2200 degrees Fahrenheit, a process that had turned them into glass-like structures. Sometimes, or in other parts of the forts, the walls were turned into a molten mass. Other times, the vitrification was partial. The stones were only partially melted, and in many instances, a kind of glassy enamel formed around the stones, binding them together. And this is strange. How and why did the Celts achieve this? It could have been deliberate to strengthen the walls, but observation does not support this hypothesis because the vitrification is too uneven and not necessarily that efficient for defense. It could also be due to accidental fires or fires started by attackers. But here again, the vitrification process needs a lot of fuel, a lot of wood, and for a long time. So it is believed it had to be intentional. It cannot be accidental. It also appears that many of the vitrified hillforts were abandoned shortly afterward. If the vitrification was intentional, one possible explanation is that it formed part of a ritual act, a symbolic offering of the entire hillfort at the moment it was being abandoned. Another possibility is that it was intended to commemorate or mark a significant event. However, the true purpose remains uncertain. The question has been puzzling experts for a long time. This effort produced to alter a work that would be then abandoned for apparently no practical benefit. This is hard to understand. That's why the mystery of the hilltop forts' vitrification goes on. Now, another mystery connected to these hill forts is that many of them were suddenly abandoned around the 1st century BC. For apparently no reason or no known reason. Archaeological evidence indicates that many of these sites remained abandoned for several centuries. Some were eventually reoccupied by post-Roman elites and early Christian communities after the collapse of the Roman Empire. We can only speculate about these reasons for this reoccupation. These hill forts offered defensive positions, and in the early Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, physical protection was highly valued. But the sudden disinterest for hill forts, including before the Roman conquest, and this long gap in their timelines, these are things that remain unexplained, probably yet another side or chapter of Celtic history that we ignore. To conclude this little journey, let's take a look at an object that was discovered in 1891 in Denmark, in a peat bog near a hamlet called Gundestrup. The object was found dismantled, but it quickly appeared that it was a massive and pure silver cauldron from Celtic times. It is about 27 inches wide, that's close to 70 meters, 16 inches tall, a bit over 40 centimeters, and weighs nearly 20 pounds, or 9 kilograms, of silver. I mentioned it was dismantled because it consists of plates, 13 plates in total, 7 outer plates, and 5 inner plates. and a base. These plates could be assembled to form the cauldron. With these dimensions, the material, pure silver, and this division into plates, it was clearly not a cooking cauldron, but more probably a ceremonial object, perhaps used in rituals, or a kind of over-the-top decorative object made to serve as a symbol of wealth and power. Because there does not appear to have been any practical purpose behind it all, the more likely explanation is that these objects served a symbolic or ceremonial role. Every plate was adorned with intricate engravings, showcasing remarkable craftsmanship. Figures were hammered and chased into the silver, depicting scenes that seem almost to pulse with life. Warriors, antlered gods, and animals, both real and mythical. So what makes the cauldron so interesting? First, there is the artistry. We don't have that many objects from antiquity, and especially of Celtic origin, that are so well made. One panel features a figure often identified as the god Cernunnos, this horned deity I mentioned earlier. Another one shows a warrior being plunged into a cauldron, possibly a scene of sacrifice or rebirth. There's even a figure riding a fish. So clearly these images are more about showing scenes of mythology or symbols than figurative or realistic art. But here's where the mysteries around this cauldron begin. First, where did it come from? Because we have seen before that the Celtic heartlands were in Central Europe, Germany, Gaul, Britain, and Ireland. Not Denmark, not that far north. The style of the cauldron does not match local Danish artifacts from that period either. In fact, the cauldron seems to mix traditional Celtic motifs like swirling patterns and torques. The torque is a rigid necklace, a kind of large neck ring, a type of object that the Celts made a lot in precious metals for the high status members of their society. So the torque is very Celtic. These Celtic elements on the cauldron are mixed with patterns from Thrace, this region to the southeast of Europe in modern-day Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. The cauldron's silverwork also suggests techniques from the eastern Mediterranean or the Black Sea area. So, was it made by Celtic artisans who traveled east? Or Thracian craftsmen for a Celtic client? We don't know. Some have suggested it could have been a diplomatic gift, but there is no indication of how it ended up in Denmark, far from both Thrace and Celtic lands. Another mystery is its purpose. Was it a sacred object used in druidic rituals? The bog where it was found was possibly a sacred site in the past, a place where offerings were made to gods, and the cauldron was carefully dismantled and placed in the bog, suggesting a deliberate act, perhaps sacrifice, an offering. It is not impossible that the cauldron was made with that purpose in mind, with its imagery of sacrifice and rebirth on the plate, and that hints at some possible religious significance. The figures themselves do not align perfectly with Celtic iconography, though. I mentioned there were Thracian elements in the style and the technique, but also figures like elephants, animals that the Celts of Western and Northern Europe could never have seen. So, does that suggest a contact with maybe Hellenistic kingdoms in the Middle East? The successor states to the empire of Alexander the Great that knew of elephants or even India. The imagery of the cauldron and its blend of artistic styles seemed to point to a world that was more interconnected than we often imagine. Yet the nature of these connections remains unclear, and that is what makes the Gundestrup Cauldron so mysterious. More than an artifact, it is like a story without an ending, an invitation to discover the connections of the Celts with other cultures, and also a glimpse at their rich world of mythological or legendary tales that have been forgotten. But none of these questions has been answered. We don't know by and for whom and why the cauldron was made, or its purpose, or how it ended up in Denmark, more than 2,000 years after it was buried. The mystery goes on. We've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep. Or, if you are not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.